Thanks, Dr. Robert. Okay, the topic's pretty clear, but you might want to know the motivation behind it. And the important thing about being able to learn how to lie with statistics is to get ahead in the research world, you really have to have a lot of publications. And you've got to have a lot of publications in high impact factor journals. And frankly, unless you're working in an area that nobody's interested in, all of the good stuff's been done. So you're very unlikely to come up with an idea that nobody else has already had and already published about. So your only alternative is to make stuff up or lie. And what I want to get through to you today is how to lie using statistics so you can get those journal publications up, you can get your citations up, and you can end up with a bunch of PhD students doing all your work for you because, well, frankly, those coffees aren't going to drink themselves in the juice bar. Now, the problem that we have is the better the journal is, the more that they're going to chuck your papers out. But we can use this information to our advantage to figure out what kinds of papers the journal editors actually want. And this is a thing called a funnel plot. So a funnel plot basically puts on the y-axis some kind of measure of the quality of a study. And as it turns out, when the studies are relatively low quality, what should happen is that the values should be spread out either side in a fairly large range around the true effect size of what's going on. And as the quality gets better and better, the effect size is going to converge on what's actually real. So it turns out that acupuncture pretty much has no effect, more or less, or a very small one. But what we can see here is there's a great big bite taken out of here. And that's not because the research isn't done, it's just because that research doesn't get published. So what we need to do is only do research that has a good positive finding. And often as not, you're not going to have those good positive findings because people have already discovered penicillin. And the thing that you're looking for is probably not going to be true. So we've got to figure out how we can use statistics to make it look like it is actually true. And that's what we're going to walk through today. So in short, under no circumstances ever let people see your data. This is really important. You're going to have to use p-values. P-values are one of your greatest allies in confusing and misleading people. If you are lucky enough to stumble across a positive finding, never ever try and replicate. This is a big rookie mistake. When you do find differences using p-values, never try and explain them in terms that people are actually going to be able to understand. This way lies madness. And finally, if you've ever got the possibility, try and use terms that statisticians like that normal people have different meanings and different associations attached to. So we'll go through these 5 points now one at a time. Firstly, don't let other people see your data. Now there's been a worrying trend recently where people are starting to go back and reanalyze data that was already existing. The baseball scouts, the people who evaluated player ability, had that market completely sewn up. And then this night watchman went back and looked at their data and said that they were completely wrong. By reanalyzing that, he basically put all of these baseball scouts out of business. You don't want that to happen to you. I noticed that in 2012, Manchester City have done the same kind of worrying thing by releasing all of their player data for the unwashed masses to go and do secondary analysis of. So this is a worrying trend that we need to try and counter. And this, tragically, this has started to spread to the scientific area, and we really need to try and squash this. This guy, Nestor Russell, did all of the heavy lifting on this particular paper, and he went back and looked at probably the most famous psychology experiment that was done in the 20th century. This was Milgram's obedience to authority experiments. Probably you've heard of this, but just in case, we'll do a quick recap of it. So Stanley Milgram put this ad in the newspapers. The newspapers were these things that they used to have. Probably ask your parents about what they were. But you could earn $4 plus 50 cents for your travel time if you needed to by coming and volunteering for a study of memory. And what it turned out was, when you turned up there, oh sorry, I should say that the premise for this, the setup for it was that at the time, Adolf Eichmann was being tried for Nazi war crimes. And what Milgram thought stemmed from some of the things that Eichmann actually said during his trial. In essence, he said he was just following orders. So
it was not my personal affair. I had to do what I was ordered.
So basically Milgram's defense was, look, I was just following orders. Eichmann's defense was, and Milgram said, that's probably fair enough. I might do an experiment and I'll prove that this is the case. I'll prove that he was just following orders. So when you responded to this ad, you turned up to the experimenter's office, and it so happened that you turned up at the same time as another pseudo-volunteer. And the experimental setup was more or less like this. If you were the actual volunteer, you played the role of the teacher. And this guy here, who you thought was another volunteer, was the learner. And he was doing a learning study. And basically the idea was that this machine here, with all of these knobs and switches on it, you would give this guy a learning task, and every time he got it wrong, you had to escalate the amount of force, the amount of voltage that was going through the learner. And as this got worse and worse and learned more and more, the guy would cry out more and more in pain. And at the end of this, it turned out the headline take-home message from it was right up here past danger, severe shock, and up around 420 volts and XXX was 2 out of 3 subjects would administer a shock that they thought was lethal to a complete stranger within 1 hour of meeting them because they were ordered to do it. And since then, this research has been, like I said, the most famous piece of research in psychology, and it would have stayed that way if this guy hadn't have let other people see his data, fortunately after he passed on, so it didn't affect his career at all. So if we remember that 2 out of 3 of these subjects are going to administer a lethal shock, and the whole thing is they were just obeying authority. Now Milgram knew that people weren't just going to go along with this and ramp it all the way up. So the person who played the experimenter had a very tight script that he had to follow. And every time you disagreed with him and said, I don't want to do this, you were asked to do, you had to say exactly from the script what to tell the person to do. So it went something like this.
Check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
Check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
So it started off with something quite polite. I'm requesting you to continue. It would ramp up a little bit further, and it would go up to say that, look, we really need the experiment to go on. And when it actually got to the stage of being an order, I demand that you do this. You have no other choice but doing this. What percentage of people do you reckon actually obeyed that order and went on and flipped the switch?
Continue using the last switch on the board, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
You think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the
But
experiment.
what if something's happened and man had an attack or something in there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
You had no other choice, teacher.
I don't have a choice. I'm not going to go ahead with it.
Well, we'll have to discontinue the experiment then.
I'm sorry.
Here's another one.
We had no other choice. You must
Yes,
go
I
on.
have a choice.
That is, if you don't continue, we're going to have to discontinue the experiment.
We'll have to. He says cut it out. After all, he knows what he can stand. That's my opinion. That's where I'm going to stand on it.
So once it becomes an order, nobody ever believed it. Nobody ever did it. If you suggest, if you say it's for the greater good, lots of people will do it. The instant it's an order, the instant they were obeying authority, nobody actually obeyed authority. And this tipped everything on its head. So that's a trap for the unwary. Don't let people see your data. As soon as you publish your results, destroy your data. Never let any secondary analysis. Worryingly, there's been an increasing trend for people to go back and do these kinds of secondary analyses. The Cochrane collaboration's a particular villain here. From 1972 to 1991, there were 7 studies that looked at giving corticosteroids to pregnant ladies where premature birth was likely. And it turned out that despite the fact that if you pooled all of these results, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 as many babies were going to die, this research was completely ignored. So over that period, probably tens of thousands of babies unnecessarily died because people didn't go back and look at that secondary research, which is kind of a shame. But we can use this to our advantage. So this is an isokinetic analysis. This is stuff that I've spent tragically hundreds of hours doing, where people push their leg backwards and forwards, and we see how much strength people get in their muscles at the front and at the back towards here. And now after doing an awful lot of these, I'm in the glorious position of being able to be very vague with my research results, because If I take some different approaches to my results, if I use p-values, of the 15 p-values that we look at, 5 of them are statistically significant in saying that isokinetic testing is really good. This is with 1,600 subjects and about 150 injuries. If I use logistic regression though, to walk you through this, if we say that there are 156 injuries and we just pretend we'll say nobody's going to get injured, and you use a logistic regression, I would only correctly classify one of those injuries. So basically I could say it's completely useless. If I use a Bayesian approach, I'm going to end up with likelihood ratios in excess of 1,000. And to give you a bit of an idea, a likelihood ratio of 100 would take our would take our likelihood from 13% up to 90%. So what it means is, depending on what kind of story I want to tell, with exactly the same data, I can say isokinetic testing is worse than useless, it's a complete waste of time, or look, we're really not sure, you need to give me some more funding and some more research time and I need to get to the bottom of this. Or if I want to get funded by Biodex, I could say this is the best thing since sliced bread and I'm going to be able to predict all of your hamstring injuries. Now, of course, once I decide on which one of these stories the journal editors are most likely to publish, I must destroy all of the other analyses so nobody could ever go back and look at it. Our second ally is to use p-values. Now, p-values, part of the reason I have no friends is what I used to do was every time I'd meet somebody and found out that they were interested in science, I'd ask them to define for me, what's a p-value mean? And when I first discovered what this was, I probably like you, I learnt what p-values were just to pass an exam as an undergraduate physiotherapist, but I never really got it and something never quite gelled. So later on I spent some time to actually go and learn what p-values were, and once I figured it out, it was like Alice through the looking glass. I couldn't believe everybody genuinely didn't know this. So I would ask people, I thought maybe it's just me, maybe I didn't understand these things. As of last week, I've officially stopped asking people what p-values were, and the final event that stopped me from doing this, I happened to be at dinner with a journal editor, let's call him Karam, and at the same dinner that we were at, there's the most famous physiotherapy researcher that there is. And I did my standard party trick. We got to talking about statistics, as you do when you have no friends. And I said to this particular guy, so tell me, what do you think a p-value means? Complete silence. He didn't want to admit that he didn't know. And I prodded a little, and then it got awkward, so we just stopped and we started talking. If he doesn't know, if the journal editor doesn't know, and if everybody else people genuinely don't know what it is. This is what a p-value is, and when I practiced doing this talk and started reading that out, I actually put myself to sleep, so I'm not going to go through what it means for you. But it involves something called a null hypothesis, saying is there really a difference, and we use these values of 0.05 to 0.01. We'll get back to what this means in a moment. What really set me on the path to figuring out what these things were was an article a while ago in the Journal of Statistics in Medicine, and this particular book, which is actually a pretty funny read. And the example that they give is that they say, you've got a friend who wants to lose some weight, and they've heard that there are weight loss pills on the market, and you being the statistician, you're the one who's got to tell them which is the kind of pill that we should use. So you go and look at it, and we find all of the different trials, and it turns down it comes down to 2 pills. Exactly the same cost, side effects, everything else. This pill called Oomph doesn't display a statistically significant effect on weight loss, but this pill called Precision does. So which one do you recommend your friend? You have a quick look at the conclusion, and yeah, that seems to fit. The Precision's the way to go. We have a look at the results. We look there, yep, okay, okay, p.01, yep, go and buy Precision. If you make the mistake of actually looking at the effect size though, the way that basically you calculate p-values is saying, well, if there wasn't a difference, we'll look at the amount of difference that we actually saw compared to no difference, and we'll divide that by the standard error, and we end up with this number. And basically, the bigger the number is, the lower your p-value is going to be. So in this case, Oomph is going to lose you 20 pounds, maybe as much as 30, maybe as less as 10, but that's not statistically significant. Precision, on the other hand, will lose 4.5 or 5.5 pounds. That is statistically significant. If your aim is weight loss, which is the one you should be trying? Well, of course, the statistically significant one, or otherwise the game's up. People are going to stop using p-values. If we take even bigger numbers, And so we say that there's 2 trials with 25 and 150 subjects, exactly the same numbers it turned out when we did these trials. Still p-values greater than 0.05. Precision is now off the charts, p-values. Here you might lose 34 pounds or down to as low as 6. You're still going to lose more than this one, but this is the one that's statistically significant. How could that be? How could we have all been fooled? Why does this happen? Well, here we have to go back to this guy, William Seeley Gossett, who was a brewer at Guinness, whose job it was to try and maximise the yields at Guinness. Never published under his own name, was a very quiet, humble guy, so that's where we get the student's t-test from. He published under the pseudonym of Student. Now it turns out that he actually taught this guy, Ronald A. Fisher, about this approach that he'd invented of using statistical significance. His original aim was, look, we should look at how big the effect is and we'll also use p-values. And he tried to convince Fisher that this was the way to go. Fisher was a pretty interesting character and he should be one of the heroes in our story. Among other things, being an inveterate racist, he also happens to be an inveterate pipe smoker who, despite the growing evidence that was showing that tobacco is causing cancer, he actually happened to be funded by the tobacco lobby, wrote paper after paper saying that it had nothing to do with each other. One of his highlights was he said that in fact this link that you've seen between cancer and tobacco, what the link actually is people who get cancer are then more likely to go and smoke. I reckon if we had have given this guy a big enough department and enough funding, he could have disproved gravity. Anyway, what he said was get rid of the effect size, p-values only, and it turns out that that guy was immensely powerful in the world of statistics. He ran the journals, he decided what did and didn't get published, and then because of that, he taught all of the people who taught the people who taught you statistics, and that's why we only learnt p-values. And it's all beer and skittles, except it turns out that it's probably been killing people. So this drug, you might remember, it's a COX-2 inhibitor anti-inflammatory that got pulled from the market a while ago. And the story behind why it got pulled from the market largely comes down to chasing p-values. From the original paper, because if I wasn't careful about this, I could get sued over it. All tests were done at the level of 0.05, and it turns out that because there are only 5 deaths compared to 1 in the naproxen trial, that wasn't statistically significant. So a ratio of 5 deaths for every 1 wasn't enough for us to worry about. I think 5 times more deaths than 1 probably is something to worry about, but because it wasn't statistically significant, released to the public. Now it turns out that to get only 5 deaths, which meant the p-value just crept over 0.05, 3 deaths actually had to be removed from the analysis. So 5 to 1 or 8 to 1 turned out to be the actual death ratio for using Vioxx. It turned out that that ended up, because these idiots left their data out for other people to see, it ended up costing Merck close to $6 billion when they got sued for this, and then they had to pay penalties plus pay legal fees. Whatever you do, once you find a difference, try and bury that difference in terms that people aren't going to understand. Let me explain. What we'd prefer to do is say that our difference is statistically significant. Under no circumstances, try and explain it in terms that might be significant to our patients or the coaches or the people who own the club that you're talking to. I'll give you an example. Let's pretend that there's this guy who goes in these aquathons and his 5K running times vary by a lot and he's not very good. So he might run as slow as 32 minutes or as fast as 25 minutes. For him to get a meaningful difference in the amount in how fast he runs, he probably should be running about 3 or 4 minutes faster in that 25 minutes. More than 10% for that to matter. So if you were to do some intervention on the guy, like instead of sitting at home plotting regression equations on your time, maybe go out and do some running, for that to have a meaningful effect, he would have to improve his times by about 3 or 4 minutes. So that would be the meaningful effect size for some intervention for this guy. If we take a slightly different running example, we think back from 1936 to 2012, the gold medal winning time in the 100 metres, the difference between 1936 and now. What I'm going to play now is a little sound clip where each one of the bips Each one of the bips you hear is the guys crossing the finish line from 1936 up to modern day. That's it, best to worst. So for those guys, a 1% difference makes a 0.1 of a second difference, and for those guys that's going to be highly significant. That's the difference between Usain Bolt gold medal and who was this guy? Pain is another cracker that it's really, this visual analog scale that we use from 0 to 10 has been really helpful because we've been able to say that there's statistically significant differences when people's pain changes from 7 down to 6.5 or something like that, if you get your sample size big enough. These idiots went and asked some actual patients, look, how much change in pain would make a difference to you? And it turns out that they think if they're only about 20 or 30% better on their pain, they're minimally improved. And they don't actually care until their pain gets 40 or 50% better. So a change in 1 or 2 points out of 10 might be statistically significant, but to the people it actually matters, the patients, it's clinically meaningless. They don't care less. They won't get out of bed for that. One of my favourites, and this is a really rich line for research, and all the ACL guys have already caught on to this, so I've missed the boat, is looking at knee valgus during landing. There's been an awful lot of research done on this. And now it turns out that there's highly statistically significant differences in knee valgus in landing between legs and between sports and ACL and not likely ACL. And the difference is somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees. Now I've got these identical twin robots that I keep hostage at my home, and these guys, while they're doing their single leg squats, are actually doing it at the moment with exactly 4 degrees different in knee valgus. Now that's of course highly statistically significant, so it's completely clear to you which one of these has 4 degrees more knee valgus. No doubt you can all see that. Some example from our own data is we've looked at all of the physical features in the PRP trial that we did. So when the person first comes in, we measure their flexibility, we ask them how much pain, we do some strength tests, we do a bunch of other things, and I can derive an equation which will tell you how long it's going to take for this guy to get back to sport. And that equation that I get correlates with how long they actually take to get back to sport at an R of 0.77. That means about 60% of the variance is explained. More than half of the variance is explained, and it's highly significant. If I leave it at that, I might get that one into Nature. But if I make the mistake of actually putting a graph into it, if I only just put the graph in and leave it at that, I'll probably still get away with it. But what I need to watch out for is that I only say, look, what my equation does is I say if you take 30 days to get back to sport, you actually end up taking, pretty much 30, not much away from that. If people understand what confidence intervals are, then they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, that R squared of 60% means it could be 10 days or it could be 55 days. Clinically, that's meaningless. I can't tell the coach it could take 1 week or 7 weeks to get better, but I'm explaining 60% of the variance. So wherever possible, try and leave it in terms like this, and don't let the coaches actually know what it is that you're finding here. Under no circumstances try and replicate your results. When you're lucky enough to get a positive result, leave it at that. Now, this got found a while ago in some of the ecology and evolutionary journals. These guys found that when people would find an effect, everybody who subsequently went and looked for it, the effect was getting smaller and smaller. The mistake they made, of course, was going and trying to replicate their effects. Unfortunately, people have started to notice this in the medical research as well. And then every so often people will genuinely actually go out and try and replicate these studies, and I'd say, look, it's not in your interest to try and replicate your studies, because the aim of the game is to get publications and to get your studies cited by other people. So it turns out that if you don't reproduce your studies, depending on the impact factor of the journal you're publishing in, you're actually going to get more citations, and especially if you publish in the range that we publish in. If we get an impact factor of 5, we're pretty happy about that. If the study's never been reproduced, we're going to get a lot of citations. If it has been reproduced, nobody's going to cite your paper. So under no circumstances try to replicate it. And if you know any journal editors out there, please try and make sure that they never ever let people publish papers that are trying to replicate studies that other people have done. It's just not the way we play the game. Now, Bayer unfortunately tried to do this. They went back and did some basic science that underpins all of their cancer drugs and just tried to replicate the basic science studies in chemistry that they were doing. And it turned out that 2 out of 3 of the studies that were accepted as truths, they couldn't replicate. They could in fact only replicate about 1 in 5 of the studies that they did. So the lesson here is, under no circumstances try and replicate your studies, because almost certainly you're not going to be able to. And don't let this stuff get published. Now you might think, well, what if somebody comes out and finds something that contradicts my study? You need not worry about that. As long as you're the first to print and you have some sexy, exciting story to tell, people are going to be talking about it for years to come. So back in 2007, this guy was the lead author, and the Greek mafia are going to kill me for this, but I think his name's Reanalysis. He looked at the preponderance of studies that were still being cited despite the fact that they had strong contradicting evidence from big randomized controlled trials. So somebody comes out and says this, shortly after, big randomized controlled trials say, no, that's not true. Well, that should be the end of it, but it's not. So this plays in our favor. So for example, if, and especially if you're looking in cancer, you're going to get a really long career. The effectiveness of beta-carotene for cancer prevention was pretty much tossed out in the early 1980s, and yet 25 years later people are still citing these studies. Same thing on vitamin E and cardiovascular protective effects, same thing for estrogen and dementia, and I mean I still see people citing transversus abdominis, pre-activation in low back pain. It's across all of the different studies. So don't worry too much about people contradicting your findings. It's no barrier. Finally, it's really important for us to use terms that are going to confuse the general public and the other scientific researchers. Now, one of our heroes here is a 1700s reverend by the name of Thomas Bayes, who took an idea that we all know to be true and made it really confusing, so nobody actually understands it. It's a little bit like, you and I know that 1 + 1 = 2, but if I said to you, I want you to work through this proof, which is a proof that 1 + 1 = 2, I could eventually convince you that that's not the case. So what Thomas Bayes did was invented this idea called conditional probability, which confused a really obvious fundamental theorem. So the idea is that there's probabilities and that there's conditional probabilities, and this is how you term these things. So this is the probability of some event occurring. A conditional probability is, this is the probability of some event occurring given that some other event has occurred. Okay? So let's just take a couple of examples. What's the probability that some random person lives in Qatar? Well, it's about 3 million divided by 6 billion. So it's a very low probability. What's the probability that some random person lives in Qatar given that they work at Aspetar? Well, nearly everybody who works at Aspetar lives in Qatar. We've got a few fly-in, fly-outs, so it's a very high probability. What's the probability that somebody works at Aspetar given that they live in Qatar? Well, there's only about 500 of us and there's about 3 million in the country, so that's very low. Now, the important thing is there is absolutely no way to get from this to this to this without more information. Knowing this tells you absolutely nothing about this. Knowing this tells you nothing about that. These things bear no relation to one another. Coming back to our p-values, what does a p-value actually mean? The p-value is there's a probability that there's a difference as big or bigger than the one you saw, given that there is no difference. What's that tell us about the probability of that difference, given that there is a difference, or given that we don't know if there's a difference? There is absolutely no relation between the two of those. So taking this thing, the p-value, and extrapolating to the situation where you think there is actually a difference, or where, look, we're just exploring and we really don't know, it bears no relation whatsoever. So what Bayes did essentially was the problem that I run into about once every 20 days. My locker keys, by and large, live in my backpack, but occasionally I leave them in the locker, about once every 4 weeks or so. Sometimes I clean it out, they end up on my bedside table, they might be somewhere else. So roughly the percentages are like this, that they're going to be living in my backpack. If, however, I was to go and have a look in my backpack and the keys aren't there, all of the probabilities now change. And knowing this doesn't help you at all about figuring out this. Where should I go and look? Maybe I didn't have a proper look. Probably, though, is sitting in the locker somewhere. Maybe they could be a couple of other places. Okay? There's no way, though, for us to get from here to here. So these pre-test odds are what we should be taking into account anytime we actually do use p-values. Nature had a really nice article on this a little while ago now. So if we say, look, I've had this idea, and frankly, it's a bit of a long shot. 1 chance in 20, or a 95% chance there's actually no real effect there. But I think we'll go and explore it. If we do the study and p-values come out at 0.5 or 0.1, instead of it being 95% chance there's no real effect, p-value of 0.5, we're 90% chance there's no real effect. 9 times out of 10, it's still nonsense. P-value of 0.01, 7 times out of 10, that's still nonsense. If we start at 50-50 and do the same thing, we end up with 50 down to 30, 50 down to 10%. If we think this thing is a pretty good bet, 9 chances in 10 that this is a real thing that we're looking for, and we do that same study, we've gone from being 90% sure it was real to 96, or 90 to 99. So how much has it actually changed your opinion when the chances were very good or very bad? Hardly any at all. You still believe the same thing despite these p-values. This is a cracker. I love this one, and this is really useful. And you may have suffered through this before, but sensitivity and specificity are a great way to look at different tests, and people will talk about these things. So maybe I do this test in the pre-season and I want to know, is it likely to predict, is this guy going to get a hamstring injury? And people will talk about, oh, the sensitivity of this test. But the sensitivity basically talks about what's the chance, oh sorry, one step back. The test is positive, you end up actually having the thing. I did some test, you get a hamstring injury. The test is negative, and a true negative says you don't get a hamstring injury. And then there's these other two cases that you can be wrong. The sensitivity talks about this case here. So when you actually have a pathology. So I'm doing the test, I've got an athlete in front of me, and I want to know, the test came out positive, is he going to get the injury? Well, the sensitivity tells you about the case when he actually has the injury, is going to get the injury. But I'm doing the test to try and find that out. Before the test is done, I don't know if the guy's going to get this pathology. So for sensitivity to be useful, I need to already know, is he going to get the injury or not? But I'm doing the test to try and find out if he's going to get the injury. Sensitivity by itself is completely pointless. Specificity, similarly, by itself is completely pointless. You have to combine the two of these things together to be able to figure out and predict and tell a story about the guy in front of you. So what Bayes did was said, look, the odds of something happening are essentially the odds that they were going to happen before we knew anything, and then we got some new information. So new information comes along and your opinion changes. And that's basically how we work all the time. Dr. Roberts in clinic, the guy comes in, tells him a history, and he starts to think different things. And then he does some tests on him, and he starts to think different things again. And his odds continually shift. When we do individualized experiments at that level, it tells us nothing whatsoever. So we'll take a hamstring example. In the last 6 years, about 13% of our football players in the QSL have been getting hamstring injuries. That means around about 1 in 12, and that's odds of 1 hamstring injury for 11 no injuries. If I had some test that had a likelihood ratio of 10, let's say, remember our Bayesian examination said I could get to 100 or 1,000, but if that test had a likelihood of 10, I can now say, and it's positive in this guy, that 10 times 1 becomes 10 compared to 11, so that's now 10 out of 21, so now we think he's about 50% likely of getting it. 50% likely he's not going to get it. We've gone from 1 in 12 to 1 in 2, and that's the way we should be telling the guy in front of us. Not definitely, yes you will, no you won't, because that just never happens. So we take some of our hamstring data, for example, and these are the likelihood ratios that we generate if we do this particular kind of measure. And depending on where you are relative to the average of the whole group, the likelihood ratios change an awful lot. So I have to zoom in here because you'll see the likelihood ratios here are 200, 1,000, a long way north. So if it turns out that you're about 30% less than average, then we've got likelihood ratios of about 25. If you're 40% worse off than average, likelihood ratios of about 60. 60% worse than average, now your likelihood ratios are about 150. We've gone from unlikely to extremely likely, and I'm tailoring it to that individual right in front of me, but not at the group level at all. So in short, and to summarise, if you're planning a research study, what you never ever should do is first of all go to Aziz, the statistician, and try and explain to him, look, this is my study, this is the background behind it, this is what I understand to be, and here's what we think we're going to find out. Because if you do that, the statistician's going to say, all right, well, this is the kind of study you should do, and this is the way you should analyse your data. Worse, under no circumstances should you try and learn any of these statistical concepts. Now, it's pretty hard for Aziz to learn sports science and orthopaedic surgery and sports medicine and cardiology. Relatively speaking, it'd be easier for us to earn some stats. But if you do go and learn those statistics, then later on, you're never going to be argued that, look, I just got the statistician to do the thing. This is the analysis that we always do. You're not going to be, you will not have plausible deniability with this. So to finish up, I'm going to leave, this is again to show you how deeply I misunderstand humour. I'm going to show you what I think is the funniest cartoon I've seen in my life. Thank you very much.